By the Grace of Lady Vader. Chapter 10. Amidala and her husband stood in the lift, listening to it hum as it raced them to the bows of the Super Star Destroyer. She frowned at him anxiously. "You didn't have to come with me, Anakin. I would much rather have one of us on the bridge overseeing the chase." "I will return to the bridge as soon as this is over," he replied. "It's hardly a real interrogation. We know where the children are. We have all the answers we need." "If that is so, you would have allowed another officer to assume this duty for you." His arms folded in front of him. "Clearly you have your own agenda here, Amidala. And while I also—" "My own agenda?" she said, her eyebrow arched. "And here I thought that the children were our agenda. Forgive me." His head snapped toward her, and Amidala suddenly had the strange feeling that she could see his eyes narrowing at her, his lips pursing in disapproval, his brow furrowing at her. The expression he always used to give her when she exasperated him. But the moment quickly passed, as her head told her that all she was truly seeing was the mask. She was troubled by it, and she suddenly felt out of sorts, not because she had thought she could see his face, but because she hated the later realization that all she could really see of him was the mask. Over time, she had managed to accept the necessity of Vader, of why he looked this way and acted this way, but that was only by knowing in her heart that her Anakin was still there, that she could see him and reach him. She resented reminders that things weren't always that simple. The lift slowed to a stop. He stepped forward into the hallway, but she touched his arm to hold him back. "I'm sorry, Anakin," she whispered, hoping that no one else was in the hallway to hear her. "I've been on edge about all of this. I don't even know what I really want to ask them, but we know that they knew our children. I just want to know what they know." "As do I," he replied. Then he added, "I know this has been difficult for you, Amidala, but it will soon be over. In the meantime, if you wish to question the rebels, I understand." She nodded, and they left the lift and headed toward the interrogation cell. There were only 3 rebels in the room. The rest, she assumed, were still in the medical bay, being treated for injuries sustained during the boarding of the transport. 2 men and a woman were seated on the floor on the far side of the room, looking exhausted, defeated. Amidala's heart went out to them. These people had risked everything waiting for her children, delaying the departure of the last transport for them. That was not a crime as far as she was concerned, and as long as they were cooperative and helpful, she would personally make sure they didn't pay for trying to save the twins. All 3 looked up and gasped when she entered the room. One of the men tried vainly to back away when he saw Vader. That was the reaction they normally received. She and Anakin had a tacit understanding that his presence was helpful to her in trying to win the rebels' clemency. Sometimes they would all but run into her arms, telling her anything she asked, because Anakin did nothing more than stand behind her and breathe. Amidala knew firsthand what could happen to some of these prisoners if they didn't let her help them. It was more than worth it to her to have them scared for a few moments, if it would spare them imprisonment, or torture, or worse. She walked across the gray, bleak cell and crouched in front of the 3, meeting them eye to eye, hoping her posture and demeanor were calm and welcoming. Anakin stood further back, his shadow cast over her. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. The 2 men nodded slowly. The woman gave no answer. "I'm here to ask you a few questions, and to offer you clemency. I hope you'll listen." The younger of the 2 men couldn't take his eyes off Vader. The woman had affixed Amidala with a defiant glare. Both of them were rather young. The other man was considerably older. They were probably around the twins' age. "Tell me, did any of you know Luke Skywalker or Leia Organa personally while serving with them in Hoth?" None answered. "Please, you've been with them at the base for months. Surely you must be able to tell me something about them." Like what? The older man asked warily. Anything, Amidala said with a shrug. Really, whatever you know about them. Anything about what they're like. Her voice trailed off. She realized how odd her question must have seemed to them, but didn't really know how to phrase it. The older man was about to speak again when the woman interrupted. "Don't answer any of her questions," she snapped. "Don't fall for this." "Fall for what?" Amidala asked. "I'm not trying to fool anyone. If you cooperate and answer my questions, you will not be prosecuted. I'll see to it personally." "And all we have to do is sell out the Alliance? And Luke and Leia?" The woman snorted. "What a generous offer." Amidala felt her husband move, saw his shadow lengthen as he took several steps forward. "Do not doubt our lady's intentions." He stared down at the younger man, who shuddered under his glare. "She is giving you far more consideration than you will receive elsewhere." "Your loyalty to Luke and Leia is admirable," Amidala said, adding softly, "It shows that they are good leaders." She glanced at the woman. "But I don't believe that they would want you to sacrifice yourselves when I'm asking for simple information that will in no way harm the rebellion." "That's a lie," she replied through clenched teeth. "Why would you ask us for useless information?" "Because it's not useless to me," Amidala said simply. "But if you truly do not want to help me..." Anakin stepped past Amidala. The woman jerked sharply and was soon struggling to her feet. Actually, she was struggling against being brought to her feet. She kept up a futile fight as Anakin lifted her by the shoulders with the Force. What are you doing? Let me go!" The men looked at her in confusion and panic as they tried to figure out what was happening. "You will come with me," Anakin said. He hit a button on the comlink on his wrist, and several stormtroopers quickly entered the cell. "Take her away," he ordered. As a stormtrooper grabbed her, Anakin released his grip, and the woman suddenly thrashed about in surprise. Several of the stormtroopers brandished their blasters at her. "Wait," the younger man pleaded. "Just wait. You haven't even asked us any real questions yet. How are we supposed to answer? Do you want to know where they are?" "Don't!" the girl yelled angrily. I can tell them where Luke is. What difference does it make now anyway?" he replied. Amidala shook her head. "We already know where they both are. The Falcon is within range of this destroyer as we speak." Both men started a bit at that declaration. Amidala frowned at them. "What? I assure you that they won't be harmed. We're simply trying to..." "If I told you that you were wrong and gave you the right information, would you give us all clemency?" Amidala turned back to Anakin with a quizzical glance, wondering if he could determine if the man was lying. But Anakin hadn't moved, and seemed to be interested in what the prisoner was going to say. "As long as you tell me the truth, you will all be spared," she said quietly. "No!" the girl warned again. "Luke's probably dead anyway," the older man said bitterly. "Do you think anyone survived the surface battle? So how exactly are we betraying anyone at this point?" Amidala stood abruptly, almost stumbling backwards. "That's a lie," she spat out. "He's on the Falcon, with Leia." The older man shook his head. "He decided to lead the surface battle to protect the shield generator. I'm sure you know how that wound up. When we left Hoth, we didn't think anyone had survived. Luke would have been awfully lucky, I think." "And where is the princess?" she heard Anakin ask. He shrugged. "I don't know. We waited for her, and she didn't show up. I have no idea what happened to her." Amidala gave herself a moment to try to process that information before abruptly turning and leaving the room. Her head was spinning. Luke wasn't on the Falcon? He might have been killed. No! But she did not know how heavy the casualties were down on Hoth, and if Luke had been fighting instead of waiting in the control center... "He's not dead, Amidala." She glanced at her husband. "How can you be sure?" "I would have felt it. I knew he was nearby when we were on Hoth. I just didn't realize that he wasn't in the base." Amidala let herself feel relieved. She did believe him. Still. "Now he could be anywhere. We've lost him." "We will find him again," her husband replied quietly. On Dagobah. Yoda stood at the center of the stagnant pond, the water pooling around his waist and floating his robe around him in a muddy swirl. His hands were spread flat against the surface, caressing it, and his eyes were closed. That sort of sight wasn't needed for this. He pulled his focus deep into himself, found the thread of the force that connected him to all living things, and spread himself out into it. Dangerous it was these days. Dangerous because he was alone, but for Obi-Wan, who couldn't help him if he became disoriented. Dangerous because it made him visible, should anyone cast an eye in his direction. But mostly, dangerous because the Force was wounded, broken, ill. Living always and a powerful ally, but bleeding from all the places that the Empire had ripped its allies away from it. And that was why Yoda stayed alive, despite the long years and heart sickness that had fallen on him, to tend to it and repair it. Around him, the living world of Dagobah breathed and pulsed, and gave him his strength. The strength of many things working together in harmony. He gathered it, and sent out tendrils, gently, always gently, into the fabric of the Force, weaving them together, creating a stronger place, spreading the healing as far as he could. It responded, as it always did, growing stronger it was. Resilient. A moment's euphoria went through the old master, and the Force seemed to glow around him. He pulled back, sensing the strange, ugly current of the dark side seeking out the healing places, its burning hands bent on tearing and destroying what was left. Slowly, Yoda became aware again of the clammy water around his waist, and the progress of a large spider as it crawled up his arm. He set it down on a leaf, and made his way to the shore. It cannot die. Exiled, it can be. Hurt. Yoda looked at the shimmering form of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Need to take this form you do not. Hear you I can, when you do not speak in words. Obi-Wan nodded non-committally. Yes, I suppose, but young Luke needs to see this, and I ought to get some practice. Heh. Yoda started making his way back home, leaning on his gimmer stick to keep his footing. You seem not to approve, Obi-Wan commented, reforming a few meters up the path. Coming alone, he is. Are you certain? Difficult to see, he is not. Obi-Wan kept his image still until Yoda had passed him, then reformed again near the door of the hut. Perhaps it was unnecessary for him to bring Leia. She was never the one we intended to train. Yoda slammed his gimmer stick into the mud. Change things have, Obi-Wan. Change for the worse. Surely Amidala will not put Leia in danger. Sure of nothing I am with Amidala. Yoda quieted himself, feeling the cold fingers of the dark side reaching into him through his fear and anger. Put her in mortal danger, she will not. But she seeks, always seeks. Her anger is with us, Obi-Wan. She knows we acted to save the children. In her mind she knows, but her mind seeks not. Obi-Wan was silent, and Yoda could feel the eddies of sadness and confusion coming from him. He had been closer to both Anakin and Amidala than anyone, and the idea that they were both lost, it was hard for him. Yoda knew that and shared the sadness. He had come to love them both as well, but he knew they couldn't afford the sentiment. Tell her, Amidala will. Tell her everything. Her family, she seeks, as Anakin did. Cares, she does not, how they come to her. Leia is no longer hidden, so trained she must be, or stand against them she will not. Obi-Wan smiled. I think you may be underestimating Leia. I watched her as often as I could. She is as stubborn as Anakin ever was, and she has set herself against him. But no, she does not. What battle she must fight? Yoda shook his head and went past Obi-Wan to go inside. Obi-Wan formed again beside the small fire, and Yoda went on speaking to him. She will be a rock to him, and he to her, and seek, they will, to shatter one another. Matter it will not which one prevails, unless she understands. Perhaps the boy will be strong enough to destroy Vader before it comes to that. Vader, perhaps, but Vader and his queen? Yoda saw Obi-Wan recoil from the phrase, and knew that he hadn't truly faced this yet. Yes, Obi-Wan, think you must. What he will long for. Break away from Palpatine he may, possibly destroy him as destined he was. But there will be another to set in his place, another from whom he will never seek freedom, for it is for her sake that all will be done. Surely Amidala is an improvement over Palpatine. Heh, so will they think. But ever will the darkness grow. Consume the galaxy it will. Stop they must be, Obi-Wan. Can it be done? Yoda considerate. Yes, together, the boy, the girl. If neither fails, then stand a chance they do. Obi-Wan remained in his form, but faded a bit. After a long time he spoke again. I cannot conceive of Amidala destroying all our plans. I am heartsick, Yoda. Yoda offered him compassion through the Force. Yes, Obi-Wan, heartsick you are, as was Amidala. Acting from malice, she is not, though her anger is growing. Respite she seeks in the oblivion of the Empire, but afford such a luxury you and I cannot. Obi-Wan nodded, and Yoda did not feel the need to speak to him. No words would help. Outside, the rains began. Well, at least there were no TIE fighters in here. Leia tried long and hard to find something else positive. After all, there was little else to do about being stuck in the bowels of a giant space rock on a crater with a defunct hyperdrive, complete with a paranoid robot and excessively arrogant smuggler, though to be fair to Chewie, he hadn't been much of a bother. There wasn't much to be done, none that she could think of anyway. Her first inclination had been to wander around the ship, but it was bad enough being confined in such a small space for an extended period of time, with her temper as it was with Han. There were only so many places to wander here without going in circles sooner or later, and she was bound to run into him somewhere. She wasn't going to avoid him, but then she had no plans of seeking him out either. But if he comes here, which was a possibility, of course. She'd even tried holding a conversation with 3PO to alleviate the mud-thick aura of whatever this was, constantly in the air around her. But even Leia, who liked 3PO, had tired of him quickly, and found a way to discreetly dismiss him. Let Han deal with him, she thought. For now, she enjoyed the relative peace of the now silent, barely lit cockpit, even with all the shadows that always accompanied that aforementioned peace. Leia looked around more out the viewport she'd been staring at for the last hour or so. The one that itself stared, rather disturbingly, she thought, only out into pitch blackness. She thought that somewhere not far away, she caught a white glimmer of a star interrupting the indefinite expanse of monotone. And another. It was more pleasant to think about the stars and other things that were out there. The Vader's fleet was just right out there right now. So close, she imagined at times she could feel the unchanging metronome of his breath hissing right over her shoulder. Him lurking in the shadows just out of her sight, even here on the ship. She resisted the repeated urges to glance over her shoulder to confirm such a phantom's existence, knowing full well what doing so indicated. Mad. They're driving me mad, and it's only going to get worse. And she felt as if this whole chase were partly her fault. They're coming to claim what they see is rightfully theirs, she thought, with a chill that went through her like a hot vibroblade sliding through wax. Well, they're welcome to try. She knew such thoughts were somewhat petulant, but it did feel reassuring at times to spite the figures that had spawned her, even in this small manner. What she wouldn't give to actually face at least one of them now, so she could look into their eyes, or mask, and spit on their tainted feet, daring her father's renowned temper to lash out against her. Would he strike down his own flesh and blood, especially with his angel, beloved, supplicating nymph so close by, she wondered? Or if she could just get a shot at him, maybe it would be worth it, for all he'd done to her, for tainting the once happy image she'd had of her life, and taking it away piece by piece as she watched powerlessly, for taking her away from me, first her, then my innocence, then my life. She wanted him to die, knowing she hated them both. She wanted her to live to see all the pain she'd caused her offspring on her own. If he meant enough to her to abandon her own child, then it would most certainly cause her pain to lose him. Luke would tell her these feelings were of the dark side. She wondered where he was right now, hopefully far away from the Imperial fleet, on the other side of the galaxy. She could rest in the comfort that there was one thing dear to her they hadn't taken away. Leia had tried to warm herself with that bit of light, but its job was hard-pressed. She'd rather do anything than just be sitting here, waiting to either freeze to death or worse, for the Vaders to come calling. To wait for her fate to be decided by how well others played their hands. Action was always more satisfying than idly pondering on something. Part of why she was so frustrated now. All there was to do was to ponder idly. "Hiya, sweetheart." Well, things do have a way of changing, if not always for the better. Just go away, she thought at him. She had the feeling those words would have been just as ineffective, even if she'd used a Jedi mind trick to enforce them. In a way, though she'd never admit it to him, she was relieved by his arrival. Her own train of thought before then was one she didn't mind escaping at all, even if the means were somewhat less desirable than she'd have otherwise liked. Han, for once without his self-assured, cocky grin, strode, well, as much as one could in this confined space, into the cockpit. Without even asking, though Leia didn't know why he would have, he slid himself into the co-pilot's seat, apparently unperturbed at Leia stealing his normal spot. She didn't care one way or the other. She liked this chair. It was, unlike most spots in the ship, actually somewhat comfortable and didn't smell like Wookiee fur. Whether it was because she had seen it so much, or perhaps growing conditioned to it, or because she knew that she had much greater concerns in her life than whether he was uncouth enough to continue flirting with her, though she did find it extremely out of place, she was actually surprised and even a little concerned in its absence. But leave it to him to find a way to compensate for it. "What, no stinging retort?" he asked, raising an eyebrow in controlled surprise. "I figured I'd let you off one time," Leia said, not looking at him. "I imagine you might need it." Han laughed and propped his head on his forearm, leaning forward across the seat so his head was bare inches from Leia's. For several long moments his face remained in that proximity with hers, and Leia resisted the urge to flinch away. It wasn't as hard to resist as she would have liked. "You letting me off? Not in a million supernovas. I'm not buying it, princess." "Maybe I'm not selling anything," she countered, a bit more acerbically. She eyed him caustically. Maybe she should make a habit of trying to avoid him. On a ship this size, it would certainly be a feat it might take time to master, something she was definitely willing to burn. Among other things, she thought, as the caped form of Vader once more draped its shadow over her thoughts. The corner of Han's mouth twitched slightly, and much to her relief, he pulled his head away. Leia was surprised he didn't have an immediate retort of his own. For a moment, they sat there in silence, their eyes unmoving from each other. Leia had the odd impression, of two ruffian types squared off against one another in a wide, deserted alley, itching fingers poised over their triggers, each daring the other to be the first one to blink, to make the mistake. But Leia had met her match in Han Solo, and after a moment she blinked, conceded defeat, gratefully turning her head back towards the blank viewport and slinking just a bit back into her chair. Ever since he'd come in here, that view had become far more interesting, though nothing outside had changed that she could see. "Shouldn't you be working on the hyperdrive?" she went on, when it was clear there would be no rejoinder, not wanting to flat out tell him to simply buzz off. "What, and deprive Chewie of his wonderful conversation with your droid?" Han smirked, chucking a thumb toward the rear of the ship. "I wouldn't dream of it." "Your concern for him is touching," she replied dryly. She dearly wanted to snap at him, but a significant part of her recoiled at that thought of further alienating him, even after all that she'd done without hesitation in that department already, merely because he was the closest friend she had to her at the moment. She told herself, if it was Luke here instead of Han, that's not the same, and you know it. "Aren't you worried you're depriving something else important by being here?" His lips tightened. Perhaps she'd unsettled him. She didn't know why. She'd put him off plenty of times before with each much harsher words. Back at the South Passage at the base, for example. That was one instance she actually regretted, but was too prideful to admit. "Evidently not, Your Highness. If you've got any ideas, please, by all means, do tell me." He gestured expansively, emphasizing the sarcasm in his tone. "I'd think you know better than to let me do that," she said, folding her arms tighter as she turned to look at him, eyebrows raised, jaw set in a firm line. "Why are you in here?" "I thought you might be lonely. I came to talk." "Lonely? You have no idea." "And you thought you and your marvelous, winning charms could alleviate that loneliness? Is that it?" She affected a bemused expression. Friend or not, she could see him coming in here for any reason that didn't somehow include annoying her. She really had no desire to talk to him. Above all, she just wanted him to leave. She glanced briefly up into those hazel eyes, visible as ever even in the dim lighting, as if they possessed their own inner fire that hinted at the passionate interior beneath. Those eyes unnerved her in more ways than one, and yet again she found herself looking away. No doubt he's conjured his own reasons and fantasies as to why I'm behaving so. Her own mind, though, offered no original speculation in itself either. "There's only so many ways to avoid me on this ship, sister." "And why would I need to avoid you?" "You tell me." Her eyes narrowed at him, and this time she had no problem looking at him. Odd how it always seemed to be the times he irritated her the most as she found him easiest to deal with. "And what are you insinuating? That you think you're big enough concern of mine, at a time like this with the Empire's dragons breathing fire down our bare necks, to go to the effort to avoid you?" He simply shrugged, as if her latest statement hadn't been coated with daggers. "Point conceded. If you'd actually made an effort, I might not have found you by now." "Is there something you want, Captain Solo?" The grin showed itself at last. "An attitude change would be a good start, though some adhesive strips for covering a certain someone's smart mouth would probably suffice for the moment." "I don't know about the attitude change, but I'm certain there must be adhesive somewhere around here," she murmured thoughtfully, a spark of mischievous amusement creeping briefly into her expression. After all, something has to be holding this rust bucket together. "I meant for you, and you know it." Her tension levels began to quickly rise. Oh, no. She knew where this was heading, and she didn't like the smell of it one bit. "Han, if you're going to lecture me on how you find my attitude self-damaging and a pain in your behind, I can already tell you that I don't care to hear it. And if you don't like my attitude, go somewhere else." "On this ship, your worship, isn't that easy." "I thought Corellians had no use for odds." She turned her chair around to face him. "I'm sure you'll find a way to beat them." His hazel eyes narrowed at her for a moment, stealing her mouth from further action. "You don't know how hard I've tried that." His voice had dropped a level, and its softness was enough to unnerve Leia further. You know, it's not as nice and as easy to do that as you seem to think it is. I've tried, over and over, Princess. And even if it were possible, he shook his head, I know you probably hate me now. But we used to be friends, Princess. It's like if Luke was doing this to himself, he said, though for a moment she could have sworn sounded like he was trying to convince himself of something. I couldn't turn my back on him. I couldn't abandon him to something I knew would destroy him. But there's a big difference between you and Luke, he told her. And that's what Luke wouldn't be content to stew in his own anger until there was nothing left. Try to repel away people who wanted to help him. I thought you told me you didn't want to help me. What is it you think I've been trying to do? He shot back, whatever patience he'd carefully crafted beginning to wear through. You think I've been doing this, coming after you because I enjoy the exercise? Because it does good for my health? He rubbed the bridge of his nose, like he tended to do when particularly stressed. She probably saw more of that gesture than any of his other friends. Why does he keep coming back, she thought. I've seen people talk about Lord Vader with less trepidation than they talk about with the possibility of facing you. It wasn't a comparison she appreciated at all. There was no way Han could know the personal impact that statement had on her. But that knowledge was negligible in waning the surge of familiar cold fire that rose to her unbaden. Her eyes narrowed, the temperature in the cockpit actually seeming to drop a few degrees. Never compare me to him, she said slowly, forcing herself to remain steady. And I mean never. Doesn't change the truth of it. Doesn't change the fact you need help, he said, eyeing her suspiciously. Leia cursed herself for her outburst. If she kept this up, then he would know. But part of her innocently inquired, would there in fact be anything wrong with having someone else know this, to share in her pain? I am no friend by sharing this sort of pain with them. You've gotten soft, she said instead. Yeah? And what happened to you? He reached out and took her gloved hand suddenly, gripping her wrist in a firm yet oddly gentle hold. Almost fancied that she could still feel echoes of a long extinguished warmth in its contact, even through the leather glove. Leia yanked her hand away, suddenly and inexplicably repulsed. She saw the angry fire blaze in his eyes again as she did this, every time she showed an indication of herself, yet further alienating herself. But she saw someone else, saw the genuine concern in them, something she'd never seen or allowed herself to see before. And what happened to you? I wouldn't wish that knowledge on anyone. She closed her eyes for a long moment and swallowed, staunching a swell of emotion. Let's just say my past is catching up with me, far faster than I ever wanted it to, she began, standing to leave. And when it gets here, I'd rather not see those I care for hurt by it. She clenched her fist at her side. Don't follow me, she ordered him quietly, not offering any more elaboration to alleviate his perplexed expression. I've already said too much. But it had been, in a minor way, a relief to say even that, as if an almost imperceptible part of the weight crushing down on her was lifted, but it wasn't enough. He made no effort to follow her when she stormed out at last. As she glanced over her shoulder, not even the phantom of Vader was there, only the muffled thud issuing from the cockpit. No doubt Han releasing his anger by smashing his fist into a bulkhead. He had heeded her wishes and was not following her. But as the shadows that had been dissipated by his presence quickly congregated back around her again, she began wishing rather fervently that he had.